Hello. 2000 AD and Judge Dredd have been science fiction institutions in the UK since 1977. The comics are a bastion of cultural creativity, satirical storytelling, and action both humorous and extreme. But the progs were not the only place that you could find Dredd and his vibrantly violent world, because for the past 40 years, he's been judging his way across gaming tables as well. Role-playing games, war games, board games, Dredd and the 2000 AD perps have played them all. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're investigating, adjudicating, and executing the tabletop history of Judge Dredd. So, relatively recently, I spent some time at Warlord Games marvelling at their production processes, and whilst I was there, I got chatting about their Judge Dredd game. This one right here, which they very generously gave me a copy of. This is a really exciting game to me. I think Judge Dredd is such an important part of British cultural history, and it's always been part of my life, thanks to my older brother who absolutely adored it. I got really excited as I was playing around with this game, thinking about that history that the character has had, both on and off the gaming table. And not just what we can get today, but what games did we used to be able to get and play. So that is why I wanted to look at the history of Judge Dredd across all tabletop games. But of course, as with any notable IP, there are so many games that can come and go quickly. Little one-shots, little card decks, releases that seem to disappear without a trace. So I can't cover literally everything, and I can't get into as much detail about each game as I might like. I say that because I don't want Judge Pedant to be getting on my case. As much as I would love to research and document every single outing that Dredd has had on the gaming table, I'm going to have to focus in on a couple of major eras of gameplay for Dredd. We'll be starting with Games Workshop and Citadel Miniatures. How did they first bring Dredd to the gaming table through board games, role-playing games, and lots of miniatures? And then we will cross the cursed earth with a couple of bits of detail to arrive at Warlord Games and the current license. They are producing not just Judge Dredd games, but a lot of other characters from his 2000 AD ensemble. We will start before that, though, by taking a look at the history of Dredd himself. If you didn't have an older brother who was madly into 2000 AD and the Judge Dredd magazine, what exactly is a Judge Dredd? Judge Dredd is a total bastard. In the dystopian future, the law of Megacity 1 is enforced by the street judges. Individuals empowered to arrest, convict, sentence, and even execute criminals on their own initiative. Their authority is absolute and instantaneous. And whilst this is a world of near-endless crimes and misdemeanors, the justice handed out by the street judges can often be extreme. And there's no clearer example of this extreme justice than Judge Joe Dredd himself. Conceived by Pat Mills and created in 1977 by writer John Wagner and artist Carlos Esquerra, Judge Dredd first appeared in the second issue of 2000 AD, the weekly sci-fi fantasy anthology comic that regularly satirised contemporary UK and US politics at the same time as telling phenomenally creative and exciting science fiction and fantasy stories. 2000 AD, the Judge Dredd magazine, and many other titles over the years have featured these characters, as well as spinning off into all sorts of different releases, including, of course, a couple of movies, and even a few brief trips into Gotham City for Judge Dredd himself. So that's the who and what of Judge Dredd. The next is the why. Not leave a like on this video, because it would be a crime not to. With its cultural comedy and commentary and exciting action, 2000 AD quickly rose to prominence in certain circles in British society, and its publisher, IPC Magazines, readily found an accomplice in a company that was driving a different kind of cultural change, one that was making gaming more accessible and acceptable, a company called Games Workshop. For almost a decade, Games Workshop had been licensing, importing, and printing role-playing and board games into the UK. And in 1980, they had moved into designing and publishing their own bookshelf-style boxed games. With development managed by Albi Fiore, the initial range included 4 new titles. Warlock, designed by Bob Connor and with cards illustrated by legendary fighting fantasy artist Russ Nicholson. Valley of the Four Winds, designed by Owl and Weasel and White Dwarf contributor Lou Pulsifer, and based on a 1978 range of minifigs. Apocalypse, a reworking of Steve Jackson's favourite board game by Mike Hayes, The Warlord. And finally, a game about famed BBC character Doctor Who, designed by Derek Carver, who would later write Blood Royale and of course work with Andrew Lloyd Webber on Calamity. Check out my video here if you want to know more about that unusual bit of Games Workshop history. With the success of these games, each having sold as many as 5,000 copies, GW wanted to continue to expand its range, and Fiore would manage the development of Talisman by Bob Harris and Battle Cars, designed by Ian Livingston with art by Gary Chalk. And of course, there was another game developed for this expanded range as well. Games Workshop co-founder Ian Livingston wanted to make sure that they got the license for the comic that he loved the most, 2000 AD. And not just that, he wanted to design the game that was going to be based on Judge Dredd himself. In his book about the early days of Games Workshop, Dice Men, Ian Livingston remembers his work on the game. Having in-depth knowledge of Megacity 1 and the world of Dredd inspired me to develop an authentic game which I hoped would appeal to Dredd fans. I concentrated on capturing the characters and the craziness of Megacity 1 in an easy-to-play crime-fighting game, where you could even arrest Judge Death for littering. Development on this Dredd board game took nearly 2 years, with Livingston and Games Workshop keen to produce a game that brought such a strong and commercially valuable world to life. At release, the game cost £7.50, which is about £33 today, and it let players experience crime fighting in Megacity 1. Each player takes on the role of a judge, and the game takes place on an incredibly detailed and genuinely awesome board illustrated by Dredd artist Brian Bolland. It perfectly captures the wild, frenetic, and overcrowded feel of the megacities from the comics. It was an absolute pleasure to work with Brian Bolland and Ian Gibson on the design of the board and box, as they were arguably the 2 most famous artists working on the Judge Dredd strip in the weekly 2000 AD comic. In the various locations on the board, you will find perps doing what perps do best: crimes. Players have to catch, fight, and arrest them. And because perps and crimes are randomized, you can end up with surreal bits of ridiculousness. And that's not to mention the attention to detail that has been put into making the cards feel like they're part of this world. You can tell this was created by someone who really cared about the characters. Reviews for Livingston's passion project were largely positive, with the game's relative simplicity balanced against its sense of fun and theme. Richard Meadows in White Dwarf 35 wrote, "Judge Dredd is a good game for some light relaxation for both Dredd fans and those who have never heard of him. It is admirably successful in both its aims. It doesn't set out to be a game of deep skills and great complexity. It sets out to be simple, playable, and as enjoyable as reading your favourite comic book." Imagine Magazine, TSR UK's rival to White Dwarf, covered the game in its very first issue, where Paul Coburn felt that the game lived or died on your interest in Dredd himself. The rules, cards, and board are all developments of the values and humour featured in the comic strip. In that sense, it is a fine tie-in. Fans of the comic will find the game an amusing chance to identify themselves with their hero. Other customers might find this violent city too depressing and possibly distasteful. That alone limits the appeal of a fine game with excellent opportunities for player interaction and fine balance. If you like mayhem, this has to be a winner. This was the first game that put Judge Dredd on the gaming table and allowed players to immerse themselves in his world. That alone makes this an important moment in Judge Dredd gaming history. But the fact that it was a fun gameplay experience, even if it wasn't that complicated, also means that it's had longevity beyond its initial years. We'll come back to that later. In 1985, Dredd co-creator John Wagner, along with fellow 2000 AD writer Alan Grant, would actually work with GW on a dedicated comic strip set in the world of Warhammer Fantasy, The Quest of Caleb Dark, champion of the Chaos God Malal. But that's really another story for another video. What we're here for today is Judge Dredd, but there is still a relationship between Warhammer Fantasy and Judge Dredd that you might not expect. In White Dwarf 36, Ian Livingston introduced his new board game to the world, and in it he mentioned that there was work going on to produce a role-playing game set in the world of 2000 AD as well. But it wouldn't be until 1985 that the RPG actually made it through development and onto shelves. The first draft was developed by Rick Priestley, based on his Warhammer Fantasy Battle rules. Ian Livingstone felt, though, that it required a little more work done before it could be released as a new product, and so he looked to bring in a new games editor. That new recruit was Mark Gascoigne, who recalled, "Livingstone gave me an early draft of some rules for a Judge Dredd skirmish battle system by Citadel's Rick Priestley. Challenged to tell him what I'd add, or changes to make it work as a full role-playing game, I did just that, at some length. My job as games editor was pretty simple. Kick the Judge Dredd role-playing game into shape by developing the rules and adding notes on the famous Mega City 1 setting. Once the game was released, it was relatively slow going before there would be any supplements with which to enhance your dreadful adventures, but eventually they would come. Judgment Day by Marcus Rowland is a complete campaign featuring 4 scenarios set in Mega City 1 and the Prison Moon Titan. In it, players must prevent the microchip holding a digital backup of the mind of tyrannical Judge Cal from falling into the wrong hands. Richard Halliwell, the co-creator of Warhammer Fantasy, wrote several Judge Dredd products for Games Workshop, including an adventure box called The Slaughter Margin. The adventure features a plot built around complex sabotage, robotic dog mayhem, primate gang felonies, political intrigue, and near-nuclear terror. The box set City Block expansion was designed by Halliwell, Carl Sargent, Alan Merritt, and Graham Davis, and provided a wealth of material for building megacity blocks of your own. The box includes floor plans for apartments, bars, courtyards, supermarts, vehicles, and all sorts of stuff, as well as tables for randomizing layouts and occupants. Interestingly enough, the manual also includes official rules for using the floor plans as battlefields in Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader. In 1996, the cruelly short-lived British gaming magazine Arcane featured a reader's poll of the 50 best role-playing games of all time. It is a curious list, to be honest, but there are many legitimately timeless classics in there as well. And in position 21 was the Games Workshop Judge Dredd RPG, almost a decade later, and it was still much loved. And no doubt some of that love came from how Games Workshop supported the game during its run. It did the 2 things that it's gotten very good at doing, even back then. Number 1, Citadel produced a range of beautifully sculpted miniatures. And number 2, White Dwarf wrote a lot of articles. The Citadel Miniatures Judge Dredd range was just the first of several that have attempted to capture the breadth of iconic characters from the pages of 2000 AD, and they did do a pretty good job. There are miniatures for the named and generic judges, both on foot and mounted on their Lawmaster bikes. Dredd himself saw several releases, and of course, there were plenty of perps, fatties, uglies, muties, clegs, and other assorted ne'er-do-wells. The Angel Gang and the Dark Judges also made it into the range, along with other 2000 AD ensembles like those from Rogue Trooper and Strontium Dog. Many of the characters these minis represented were included in scenarios and boxed releases, like the Sky Surfer Gang from the Slaughter Margin scenario, but many would find new rules and support coming from White Dwarf. New GM options and scenarios written by Warhammer Fantasy roleplay scribes like Carl Sargent and prominent RPG writers like Marcus Rowland provided plenty of ways to expand your game. Side judges, perps as player characters, rules for narcs, all of them could spice up gameplay, and scenarios like The Trouble with Time and To Live and Die in Megacity 1 offered up plenty of wild adventure. Many of these White Dwarf articles would end up reprinted in the Judge Dredd Companion, along with a selection of additional new material as well. Though one article that didn't make it into the Companion but is worth a look if you play Ball are rules for Judge Dredd in Blood Bowl. White Dwarf issue 88 includes complete rules for running teams of judges or fatties on the Blood Bowl pitch, a wild bit of cross-promotional brilliance. The board game and RPG were not the only Judge Dredd related properties released by Games Workshop over the years though. In 1987, GW put out a new board game designed by Richard Halliwell called Blockmania, along with an expansion called Megamania. These allowed players to run opposing tower blocks in the chaos of Megacity 1 and to go all out in a block war. And strangely enough, there was a city block in the game named after Sly Stallone, who would later go on to star as Dredd in the movie Judge Dredd. Now that's a Dredd. Double whammy.
Double whammy. Double whammy.
Games Workshop also published a Rogue Trooper board game, also designed by Richard Halliwell. But the story of that game and the regular confusions of its name with a certain other rogue property from Games Workshop are probably for another time as well. Though in the 90s, Games Workshop left their IP licensing and things like Dredd behind, it's clear to see that the influences 2000 AD and Judge Dredd have had on the 41st millennium are still there even to this day. There is a great deal of 2000 AD inspiration baked into the DNA of 40k, and one prime example are the Adeptus Arbites. The Arbites are the ruthless planetary police force typically employed by governors to keep the peace in the most dire of circumstances. There have been a few examples of them over the years, none quite so Dreddian as these Jez Goodwin sculpts from 1993. The Arbites are a rare sight nowadays. You're more likely to see their inferior siblings, the Palanite Enforcers, but an extraction squad did turn up in a Space Hulk in the recent Kill Team Soul Shackle box. With Citadel out of the judging business, there was a multi-year sentence for Dredd, where there wasn't a clear system or support for playing games with Dredd miniatures. But there were still Dredd miniatures being produced, and some of them are very nice indeed. For several years, WarGames Foundry, the company that Brian Ansell founded in 1983, and which inherited several Citadel casts after he left Games Workshop, went on to produce their own range of Judge Dredd miniatures. These were largely sculpted by Tim Prow, and first hit shelves in 2003, and were on sale until they were discontinued in around 2017. One range you can still buy from the Foundry, though, are Brian Ansell's Empirical Absolution and Liquidation Squad, which date back to unreleased Citadel work, and appear to share some DNA with the Citadel Dredd range, though with arguably cooler Custodes-style hats. And that wasn't the only action for Dredd around the start of the new millennium. A British RPG publisher called Mongoose had started to make a name for itself by publishing D&D supplements under the OGL license, and they wanted to get in on the Dredd action themselves. In a business strategy probably not unfamiliar to Games Workshop fans, Mongoose began publishing new editions of licensed games such as Traveller, RuneQuest, and Paranoia, and then they picked up the license to create new Judge Dredd miniatures and RPG books. The first edition of the Mongoose Dredd RPG was called the Judge Dredd role-playing game, and it used the D20 system from Wizards of the Coast's OGL. This edition was published in 2002 and designed by Mongoose founder Matthew Sprange. In 2005, Sprange also designed a small miniatures game based on Judge Dredd called Gangs of Megacity 1. Mongoose Publishing became a part of the gaming company Rebellion Developments in 2008. Rebellion was formed in 92 to produce video games like Alien vs Predator and later Sniper Elite. But again, as the new millennium approached, they were looking to expand their horizons. And since 2000 AD, Rebellion have owned the rights to Judge Dredd and 2000 AD. Using those, they have produced a number of video games based on the IP. Under their Rebellion Unplugged business, they have also created a few Dreddy board games more recently as well. In 2020, Richard Halliwell's Blockmania and Megamania were both re-released. And in 2022, there was a reissue of Ian Livingstone's original Judge Dredd game, but they also set about acquiring tabletop games publishers to produce other games as well. Now operating under the auspices of Rebellion, Mongoose went on to publish a second edition of their Judge Dredd role-playing game in 2009. Though they wouldn't use the existing rules in order to power it. Instead, they ported over a game system from one of their other IPs, Traveller. Both editions of the RPG received extensive support with plenty of supplements. And like GW before them, Mongoose provided miniatures suitable for both role-playing and miniature wargaming as well. In 2010, they produced a brand new Judge Dredd miniatures game, which intended to provide players with the opportunity to skirmish in and around Megacity 1. And 2 years later, in order to expand their miniatures offering, Mongoose launched a brand new Kickstarter, one called Judge Dredd Block War, that was massive. The Block War Kickstarter was a huge campaign, with a large range of Dredd miniatures on offer. Originally looking for just $2,000 worth of investment, they actually finished up with over $100,000 of support. Despite this massive miniature success, over time, Mongoose Publishing moved away from producing miniature games entirely. They had long since stopped making minis for the likes of their Andy Chambers designed Starship Troopers game, but there was still life left in their Judge Dredd miniatures game. They just wanted a partner to produce the minis for it instead. In July 2013, Matthew Sprange announced a new partner for Mongoose that would repackage, produce, and distribute miniatures for the Judge Dredd miniatures game. And that company was Warlord Games. For several years, that relationship between Mongoose and Warlord yielded extensive support for the miniatures and role-playing games in the Judge Dredd worlds. But in 2016, even though Mongoose are owned by Rebellion, who own the 2000 AD property, they gave up the license to produce Judge Dredd-related games. I don't understand laws or contracts or licenses at all. As long as it's not written by Manny Bloom, I'm sure it's absolutely fine. There were a few other companies that did take on that license over the years. Companies like Osprey and EN Publishing produced new games based on Dredd during the 2000s with mixed success. But it was following the end of that Mongoose license in 2016 that their partners, Warlord Games, would get to not just support Judge Dredd, but fully drive the end-to-end creation of Dredd gaming at the tabletop. Founded in 2007 by former Games Workshop employees John Stallard and Paul Sawyer, with a plan to pioneer finely detailed plastic historical miniatures, Warlord Games started with Romans and Celts, expanding into the English Civil War and then beyond it, creating a wide range of historical miniatures. Being from a wargaming background, there was a clear appetite to produce robust gaming rules as well, and again the legacy of GW proved worthwhile. Warlord Games published the Black Powder system, a set of rules for horse and musket era gameplay that was designed by Rick Priestley and Jervis Johnson. Working with Alessio Cavatore, Priestley also designed Hail Caesar and Bolt Action, covering Roman and Second World War era gaming for Warlord Games as well. Over time, Warlord went on to produce games from worlds and histories unlike our own, such as another Rick Priestley title, Beyond the Gates of Antares. Having worked with Mongoose to produce miniatures for their Judge Dredd game, it is perhaps no surprise that they leapt at the chance to take over the license when the opportunity arose. In a 2016 announcement, the head of Warlord Games product design, Paul Sawyer, said, "Many of us at Warlord are ardent 2000 AD fans, so the chance to take on a license to work with the stories we grew up with and continue to avidly enjoy was something of a dream come true. If a mere earthlet might dare to quote the mighty Tharg, this is going to be Skrotnig." The license that Warlord Games took on, though, wasn't just for Judge Dredd, it was for the entirety of 2000 AD. And to live up to that, they decided to create a series of cross-compatible games. In order to test the system, they started with a small skirmisher based on Strontium Dog. Another series created by John Wagner and Carlos Esquerra, Strontium Dog follows Johnny Alpha, a search-destroy agent who is also a mutant with the ability to see through walls and read minds, the product of the fallout of a post-nuclear future in the 2160s. Warlord Games' Strontium Dog miniatures game was released in 2018, and much like in 1982, this new 2000 AD based game would be designed by a long-time fan of the comics who had roots in Games Workshop. Andy Chambers and Gav Thorpe worked on the game together in a collaboration that harkens back to their time in the GW design studio, and which would mark the start of a new era of collaborative development by these two legends. When I spoke with Andy Chambers earlier this year, he shared some of his thoughts about Strontium Dog as the starting point for this new gaming system.
The box content, the Strontium Dog's the great start point for this. The box contents for that, the verses, is Johnny Alpha, Wolf Sternhammer, plus the Gronk. So 3 miniatures, one of which is non-combatant and doesn't have a gun, versus a bad guy villain, Max Bubba, and the Bubba Gang, which is 4 other dudes. So 3 versus, well, sort of 2 really, and portable war gear is the way I always thought of the Gronk, versus 5. That's all of your miniatures for the game, and it needs to be able to play at that level as well. And it's got to be able to sort of like give you that comic book feel about it. And so it does require some very specific mechanisms to try and make that work, to make the heroes heroic enough, but still be vulnerable to being taken down by cheapskate little bad guys and things like that, but also to rip through them in a single round and so on.
The second 2000 AD related game released by Warlord Games was, of course, Judge Dredd. Launched in 2018 with a starter set called I Am the Law, the box includes miniatures for a street judge and a rookie judge, 8 block gangers, the full game rulebook, gaming mat, unit cards, tokens, dice, everything you need to play, and even some card terrain tokens as well.
One of the real challenges that we faced is that if you read like Judge Dredd or anything like that, you'll know that very occasionally that they'll pull something out. Heat seeker rounds is the classic for Judge Dredd, where they can shoot somebody around a corner, or dodgems, ricochet bullets, again, shoot people around corners, high explosive or something like that. But they only ever do it when it's dramatically appropriate to do so. Yeah, you don't stop a car with high explosives; it's just not done. So it was kind of like how you put those into the player's hands, and yet limit their usage at the same time. And you don't just literally buy them off an army list or something like that. So we went back in many ways to second edition, 40k, the idea of cards. Cards do good things on that front. Cards are marvelous. Cards introduce like a whole little extra slice of rules that you only need circumstantially. So that was the big answer for that. And it was also a way of injecting some of the larger universe background into the games as well, of like not just having the literal like physical armory cards as we call them, but for example, Judge Dredd has big meg cards, which are basically just event cards for things that happen in the big meg, which are the sort of things that you run across in the comic strips, like poingers or simp parades and stuff like that.
In order to support the games, there have been an extensive range of miniatures from Warlord, including more street judges, city def, grav pods, dark judges, hover vans, block gangs, fatties, and raiders of the mutant sky and cursed earth varieties. There is even 3D MDF terrain available like the Mega City Hab zones. And that's not to mention the various Strontium Dog and Slain specific releases. In fact, Slain is really fun, and I'm going to talk about that again at some point in the future, because I also got a copy of that and I've really enjoyed it. Plus, there is a new series of miniatures for the ABC Warriors on the horizon. Even though I'm only just starting my journey with the Warlord Games version of Judge Dredd, it's clear that the character and all of the many and varied heroes, villains, and anti-heroes of 2000 AD have already had a long and triumphant gaming journey of their own. For almost 50 years, Judge Dredd has been a British pop culture icon. And I love that his story at the gaming table has intersected with the wider shifts and changes in British gaming culture and business. Dredd first rolled his gaming dice with the emerging force that was Games Workshop. His world was explored by Mongoose as they continued to grow and evolve. And now there is arguably the widest and most detailed range of 2000 AD miniatures ever gathered on the gaming table, available from Warlord Games. Whilst I imagine there are plenty of dissections about Dredd's power as a satirical tool in the modern world, and his changing role in British culture, the only thing that I do know for sure is that no matter what drock is happening out on the streets, on the tabletop, Dredd is still making sure that the perps, punks, and players are taken care of. I hope that you have enjoyed gazing into the history of Dredd with me. I have found it fascinating to trace this trail of such a famous character through lots of different games and companies over the years. If you like this approach to videos, do let me know. I think there are some other characters that could be really interesting to explore in this way as well. And why not share with me in the comments below what your favourite Judge Dredd game has been? If you've played all of them, which one is the best? And if you've only played one, why not tell us about it? Thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. So I was going to do a joke about Martha's crime being sleeping on the job and the sentence being cuddles. But as you can see, she's not here right now. She's sequestered herself behind this wall of Dredd games. So instead, I just kind of need to sit here like a weirdo and just, wait it out.